In the spring of 1908, investigators digging through the charred ruins of a farmhouse near LaPorte, Indiana, made a discovery that would horrify the nation. Over 40 dismembered bodies buried in shallow graves, their limbs sawed with surgical precision, their skulls crushed by heavy blows. The victims had all answered the same newspaper advertisement: a wealthy widow seeking companionship and marriage, promising prosperity on her thriving pig farm. What authorities uncovered wasn't just a murder scene. It was a carefully orchestrated killing operation that had functioned for over a decade, hidden beneath the facade of rural American life. The most disturbing revelation came when they examined the headless corpse found in the basement. It was 5 inches too short and 50 pounds too light to be Belle Gunness, the woman who owned the farm. Before we continue with the story of what became known as America's murder farm, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, as this dark tale from Indiana's past continues to haunt the Midwest to this day. The truth about Belle Gunness would prove more terrifying than anyone imagined. A methodical operation of seduction, murder, and disposal that turned a Norwegian immigrant's pursuit of the American dream into the nation's most shocking criminal enterprise. LaPorte, Indiana, in 1908 stood as a testament to American progress. A thriving railroad town of 15,000 souls, where the Industrial Revolution had brought prosperity to those willing to work for it. Located just 60 miles east of Chicago, the town served as a crucial junction for the Michigan Central and Lakeshore Railroads, drawing immigrants from across Europe who sought their fortunes in the Midwest's fertile farmlands and growing industries. The surrounding countryside, dotted with prosperous farms and small homesteads, represented everything the American dream promised to those brave enough to cross the Atlantic. The town itself was a study in contrasts. Main Street boasted 3-story brick buildings housing banks, mercantiles, and professional offices, their windows displaying the latest goods from Chicago and New York. Electric streetlights, installed just 5 years earlier, illuminated the downtown area, though most residential neighborhoods still relied on gas lamps and candles. The LaPorte County Courthouse, an imposing limestone structure built in 1894, dominated the town square, its clock tower visible for miles across the flat Indiana landscape. Around it, a growing collection of businesses served the needs of both townspeople and the farmers who traveled in weekly to sell their produce and purchase supplies. The social fabric of LaPorte reflected the complexity of turn-of-the-century America. Established American families, many tracing their roots to the original settlers of the 1830s, controlled the banks, newspapers, and major businesses. But the real energy came from the immigrant communities, Germans who had fled political upheaval in their homeland, Irish escaping poverty and famine, and increasingly Scandinavians seeking land and opportunity unavailable in their crowded homelands. Each group had its own churches, social clubs, and mutual aid societies. The Norwegians in particular had established a strong presence, with their Lutheran church on Maple Avenue serving as a cultural center for the hundreds of Norwegian families scattered throughout LaPorte County. Among these hopeful immigrants was Brynhild Polsdatter Sturseth, who had arrived from Selbu, Norway, in 1881 at the age of 21. Her journey to America had been typical of Norwegian immigrants, a grueling ocean crossing in steerage, processing through Castle Garden in New York, and then the train journey to Chicago, where an established Norwegian community offered support and employment opportunities. Like thousands of her countrymen, she had fled the poverty and limited opportunities of rural Scandinavia for the promise of America. She had initially found work as a domestic servant in the homes of wealthy Chicago families, learning English, American customs, and most importantly, American ambitions. It was during this time that she transformed herself from Brynhild to Belle, shedding not just her name, but her old-world identity. She married Mads Ditlev Anton Sørensen in 1884, a fellow Norwegian who worked as a night watchman. Together, they opened a confectionery store in Chicago, pursuing their own version of the American dream. But Belle's American dream would take dark turns that no one could have anticipated. The candy store burned down under mysterious circumstances, the first of many convenient fires in Belle's life. Their home in Chicago also burned, each fire resulting in insurance payouts that kept the couple financially afloat. 2 foster children in their care died from what doctors diagnosed as acute colitis, though the symptoms, violent convulsions, extreme stomach pain, and rapid decline, would later be recognized as consistent with poisoning. Each death brought insurance money. When Mads himself died on July 30th, 1900, it was on the only day his two life insurance policies overlapped, resulting in a double payout of $5,000, equivalent to nearly $150,000 in today's money. By 1901, Belle had reinvented herself again, this time as a prosperous widow who had purchased a 42-acre farm on McClung Road, about a mile north of Laporte's city limits. To her new neighbors, she appeared to be living proof that hard work and determination could overcome any adversity. A twice-widowed woman raising children while managing a successful pig farm. The transformation was complete, from Norwegian peasant to American landowner in just 20 years. The property itself was impressive by local standards. The two-story brick farmhouse, painted white with green shutters, stood proudly at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings including a carriage house, a substantial barn, and numerous hog pens. The house featured modern conveniences, rare in rural Indiana, indoor plumbing, a telephone connection to town, and a large basement with stone walls that stayed cool even in summer, perfect for storing preserved foods and butchered meat. The farm's location, isolated enough for privacy but close enough to town for commerce, seemed ideal for a widow seeking both independence and security. Belle had cultivated a reputation as a shrewd businesswoman who drove hard bargains at the local markets but always paid her debts promptly. She was known to appear at the Roomley Banking Company on Pine Street with rolls of bills, different denominations and conditions, as if they had come from various sources. The bank president, Harvey Darroch, would later recall that she never deposited all her money, always keeping substantial cash reserves, unusual for a farmer who might need to prove assets for equipment loans or land purchases. Her children, Myrtle and Lucy Sorensen from her first marriage, and young Philip Gunness from her second, attended the local school when weather permitted. Teachers described them as quiet, well-dressed children who kept to themselves, though some noticed they often seemed anxious, particularly when asked about visitors to their farm. Miss Margaret O'Reilly, who taught at the McClung Road School, would later testify that the children seemed burdened by secrets too heavy for their young souls. They rarely played with other children, and when they did, they never invited anyone to their home. The morning of April 28, 1908, began with an unseasonable chill that had farmers throughout LaPorte County worried about their spring plantings. Joe Maxon, the Gunness farm's hired hand, had spent the previous evening in town, returning late to his small room above the kitchen. A French-Canadian drifter who had worked for Belle for only a few weeks, Maxon had found her to be a demanding but fair employer who paid promptly and provided good meals. He had noticed strange things: the frequent visitors who disappeared, Belle's late-night activities in the basement, the strong chemical smells that sometimes permeated the house. But he had learned not to ask questions. At 4:00 a.m., Maxon woke not to his usual alarm, but to the acrid smell of smoke filling his small room. The walls around him glowed with an ominous orange light, and the crackle of flames consuming dry timber grew louder with each passing second. The smoke was thick and black, suggesting more than wood was burning. There was a chemical quality to it that burned his throat and eyes. He attempted to reach the family's bedrooms, calling out for Mrs. Gunness and the children, but the intensity of the heat drove him back. The entire main structure was already engulfed, the fire burning with an unusual ferocity that suggested accelerant had been used liberally throughout the building. The floor beneath his feet was already growing hot, and Maxon could hear the support beams cracking under the assault of the flames. He grabbed his few possessions, a spare shirt, his savings of $12 hidden in a tobacco tin, and fled through his window, sliding down the kitchen roof and dropping to the ground. The impact jarred his ankles, but adrenaline drove him forward. Looking back, he saw flames shooting 30 feet into the air, illuminating the farm buildings in a hellish orange glow. The house was completely engulfed, burning with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. By the time Maxon had run the mile into town, his lungs burning from exertion and smoke inhalation, and roused the fire department, the farmhouse was beyond salvation. Fire Chief Francis Longworth, a veteran of 20 years who had seen everything from grain elevator fires to downtown conflagrations, would later testify that in his entire career, he had never seen a residential structure burn so completely or so quickly. The flames had been so intense that they had melted glass windows into puddles, fused metal fixtures into unrecognizable lumps, and reduced solid oak beams to ash in mere hours. The LaPorte Fire Department's horse-drawn pumper wagon arrived at 5:30 a.m., but there was little they could do except prevent the fire from spreading to the outbuildings. The barn, only 50 feet from the house, had its paint blistered and peeling from the heat, but miraculously hadn't caught fire, suggesting the blaze had been carefully contained to the main house. Neighbors from surrounding farms had gathered, forming bucket brigades to wet down the barn and carriage house, their faces grim as they realized the family couldn't have survived such an inferno. It wasn't until late afternoon, after the ruins had cooled enough for investigation, that firefighters made their grim discovery. Sheriff Albert Smutzer, who had arrived to investigate what was assumed to be a tragic accident, directed his men to search the cellar remains carefully. The basement, which had been constructed of limestone blocks, had partially survived the collapse, creating a debris-filled pit. As they cleared away the charred timbers and fallen bricks, they found 4 bodies huddled together in what had been the northeast corner of the cellar. 3 small forms were quickly identified as the Gunness children: Myrtle, age 11, Lucy, age 9, and Philip, age 5. Their bodies, while badly burned, were intact enough for identification. They appeared to have died together, perhaps huddled in terror as the fire consumed their home. But the 4th body presented an immediate mystery. It was an adult woman, but where the head should have been, there was nothing, not even fragments of skull or teeth that might have survived the fire. The body had been decapitated before the flames reached it, the cut marks on the cervical vertebrae clean and deliberate, suggesting the use of a sharp, heavy blade applied with considerable force. Dr. J. Myers, the county coroner, arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the devastated property. A methodical man who had served as coroner for 15 years, Myers immediately recognized that this was no ordinary fire death. The position of the bodies was wrong. They weren't found near doors or windows where victims typically died trying to escape. Instead, they were arranged in the cellar, almost as if they had been placed there. More troubling, the adult body showed no signs of smoke inhalation in the lung tissue that remained, suggesting death had occurred before the fire started. As news of the suspicious fire spread through LaPorte like flames through dry timber, whispers about Belle Gunness's past began to surface like bodies from shallow graves. Those who had known her longest recalled a pattern of tragedy and fortune that, in hindsight, seemed far too consistent to be coincidental. The stories, when assembled together, painted a portrait of a woman who had left a trail of death and insurance payments across 2 decades and 2 states. In Chicago, before she had become Belle Gunness of LaPorte, she had been Belle Sorensen, wife of Mads and mother to fostered children who never seemed to thrive. Caroline and Axel Sorensen, children they had taken in from a Norwegian orphanage, had both died within a year of joining the household. The symptoms, violent stomach cramps, convulsions, and rapid decline, had been attributed to colitis, though no autopsy had been performed. Each child had been insured for $1,000, substantial sums that had helped the Sorensens recover from their various business failures. The death of Mads Sorensen himself now took on new significance. July 30th, 1900, had been the only day his 2 life insurance policies overlapped, one expiring at midnight, the other taking effect at 12:01 a.m. Mads had died that very day, supposedly of a cerebral hemorrhage, but Dr. Charles Gillette, the first physician to examine the body, had noted symptoms consistent with strychnine poisoning: the characteristic sardonic grin, the arched back, the clenched fists. His concerns had been overruled by the family physician, Dr. Frederick Olson, who had been treating Mads for an enlarged heart. No autopsy had been performed, and Mads had been quickly buried in Forest Home Cemetery. With the $5,000 from Mads's death, a fortune for a working-class Norwegian immigrant, Belle had moved to LaPorte in 1901, purchasing the McClung Road farm from elderly widow Mattie Alderfer. Within months, she had married Peter Gunness, a Norwegian widower who worked as a butcher in town. Peter brought with him not only his skills with knives and knowledge of anatomy, but also his infant daughter from his first marriage. The baby died within a week of coming under Belle's care, supposedly of a sudden illness that Dr. Myers, the same coroner now examining the fire victims, had found suspicious but unprovable. Peter himself had lasted only 8 months after their April 1902 wedding. His death on December 16, 1902, was particularly bizarre. Belle claimed a sausage grinder had fallen from a high shelf, striking him on the head with fatal force. Yet neighbors who saw the body noted several inconsistencies. Wilhelm Niebergall, who had helped prepare Peter for burial, noticed that the wound didn't match such an accident. It was too clean, too deliberate, as if inflicted by a weapon rather than a falling object. There were no defensive wounds on Peter's hands, strange if he had seen the grinder falling. Most tellingly, Belle had claimed scalding water had also fallen on him, but there were no burns on the body. The coroner had ordered an inquest, and for a brief moment it seemed Belle's run of fortune might end. But she had produced witnesses, farmhands who swore they had heard the crash, neighbors who testified to Peter's habit of reaching for high shelves despite Belle's warnings. The investigation was dropped, and Belle collected another insurance payment, this one for $3,000. She used the money to expand her farming operation, purchasing additional land and modern equipment that made her farm one of the most successful in the county. But it wasn't just her husbands who died under mysterious circumstances. There was Jenny Olson, the daughter of Peter Gunness from his first marriage, who Belle had adopted after Peter's death. A bright, pretty girl of 16, Jenny had been popular at school and was being courted by several young men in town. Then, in September 1906, she had suddenly disappeared. Belle told everyone that she had sent Jenny to California to finish her education at a Lutheran college in Los Angeles. She even produced letters supposedly from Jenny, though several people noted the handwriting looked suspiciously like Belle's own. When concerned teachers from LaPorte High School inquired about Jenny's address to send her academic records, Belle always had excuses. Jenny was traveling, or had moved to a new boarding house, or was too busy with her studies to write. Mrs. Elizabeth Tressler, who had been particularly fond of Jenny, had written repeatedly asking for the girl's address, only to be told that Jenny didn't want contact with her old life in Indiana. It was a cruel response that had hurt Mrs. Tressler deeply, but it had also effectively ended inquiries about the missing girl. The investigation took a dramatic turn on May 4, 1908, when Asla Helgalian arrived from South Dakota, his weathered face etched with worry and determination. A successful wheat farmer who had worked his land alongside his brother Andrew for 15 years, Asl carried with him a leather satchel containing over 80 letters, correspondence between Andrew and Belle, that revealed a carefully orchestrated seduction spanning several months. The letters would prove to be the key that unlocked the full horror of Belle Gunness's crimes. Andrew Helgalian had been what the Norwegian community called a marriage-minded bachelor, a successful man who had devoted his youth to building prosperity and was now, at 49, ready to find a wife and start a family. He had accumulated nearly $3,000 in savings, owned his farm outright, and was respected in the Norwegian settlements of South Dakota. When he saw Belle's advertisement in the Minneapolis Tidende in October 1907, it had seemed like providence. Here was a fellow Norwegian, already established with a farm and children, seeking exactly what he had to offer. The first letter from Belle, dated October 20, 1907, was businesslike but warm. Dear Mr. Helgalian, I received your response to my advertisement with great interest. It is not often one finds a countryman who has achieved such success in America. I, too, have worked hard to build something lasting in this new land. Perhaps we might find that our fortunes and our futures could be joined to mutual benefit. I have enclosed a photograph of myself and my farm. As you can see, I am not without means, and though I am no longer young, I maintain myself well. If you find what you see agreeable, I would welcome further correspondence. Over the following weeks, Belle's letters had grown increasingly intimate and urgent. By December, she was writing, My dear Andrew, your letters bring such light to my lonely days. The children ask constantly when Mr. Andrew will visit. I have perhaps spoken of you too often at dinner. This farm needs a man's strong hand, and this woman needs a companion who understands the value of hard work and the beauty of our Norwegian traditions. Come to me, Andrew. Come soon. The most damning letter was dated January 13, 1908, written in Belle's distinctive hand, with its peculiar mixture of formal English and Norwegian constructions. To the dearest friend in the world. No woman in the world is happier than I am. I know that you are now to come to me and be my own. I can tell from your letters that you are the man I want. It does not take one long to tell when to like a person, and you I like better than anyone in the world I know. Think how we will enjoy each other's company. You, the sweetest man in the whole world. We will be all alone with each other. Can you conceive of anything nicer? I think of you constantly. When I hear your name mentioned, and this is when one of the dear children speaks of you, or I hear myself humming it with the words of an old love song, it is beautiful music to my ears. My heart beats in wild rapture for you, my Andrew. I love you. Come prepared to stay forever. The phrase, prepared to stay forever, would haunt investigators and the public alike. In the context of what was discovered later, it seemed less like romantic hyperbole and more like a sinister prophecy. Andrew had taken it as a declaration of love, withdrawing his entire life savings of $2,900 from the Farmers State Bank of Aberdeen on January 2nd, 1908. Bank President Lars Thorvaldsen remembered Andrew's excitement. He was like a young man going to his first dance. He had bought a new suit, new boots, even a gold watch chain. He said he was going to Indiana to start a new life. When Sheriff Smootser questioned local bank officials in LaPorte, he discovered that Belle and Andrew had appeared together at the First National Bank on January 14th, just one day after his arrival. Harvey Darroch, the bank president, provided crucial testimony. Mrs. Gunness came in with a gentleman she introduced as her fiancé from South Dakota. They had a check for $2,900 drawn on an Aberdeen bank. I suggested that such a large sum would be safer in an account, but Mrs. Gunness insisted on cash. The gentleman seemed distracted, I would say. He barely spoke, just nodded when Mrs. Gunness said they needed the money for farm improvements and wedding preparations. She counted the bills twice before leaving, very methodically, separating them by denomination. That was the last confirmed sighting of Andrew Helgelian alive. Belle had told neighbors that Andrew had left after a few days, having urgent business back in South Dakota. When pressed for details, she had various stories. He had received word of illness in his family. He had second thoughts about marriage. He had decided to return to Norway to visit relatives. The stories changed depending on who was asking and when, but always with enough plausible detail to discourage further inquiry. Armed with Asla Helgelian's testimony and growing suspicions about the fire, Sheriff Smootser made a decision that would shock the nation. On May 5, 1908, he assembled a team of men to begin excavating the Gunness property. Joe Maxson, reluctantly cooperating to avoid charges himself, pointed out several areas where Belle had ordered him to fill in what she called garbage pits over the previous months. The first site was in the hog pen, a muddy enclosure about 50 feet from the ruins of the house. The diggers had barely gone 3 feet down when they hit something wrapped in burlap. Sheriff Smootser ordered the men to proceed carefully, and as they gradually exposed the bundle, a terrible smell arose, not just decay, but something chemical, like quicklime mixed with decomposition. When they finally lifted the sack from the muddy ground and opened it, even hardened farmers who had butchered their own livestock turned away in horror. Inside were human remains, but dismembered with surgical precision. 2 hands severed at the wrists, 2 feet cut at the ankles, and a head removed at the 3rd cervical vertebra. Asla Helgelian was called forward to identify the remains. Despite the decomposition, he recognized his brother's distinctive gold tooth and, more definitively, a silver watch still attached to one of the severed arms, a watch he had given Andrew for Christmas 5 years earlier. The big Norwegian farmer who had traveled hundreds of miles seeking answers collapsed to his knees in the mud, weeping openly as the full realization of his brother's fate struck him. But Andrew Helgelian was just the beginning. As the excavation continued, each depression in the yard yielded more horrors. By the end of the first day, they had found 4 more bodies, all adult males, all dismembered in the same methodical fashion. The pattern was consistent. Heads removed, limbs severed at the joints, organs missing. Dr. Harry Pratt, brought in from Chicago as a forensic expert, noted that the cuts showed knowledge of anatomy. This is not the work of someone in a frenzy. These incisions follow the natural lines of the body, avoiding the difficult work of cutting through bone where possible. Whoever did this had either medical training or extensive experience in butchering large animals. By May 7th, the excavation had become a massive operation. Over a dozen men were digging in shifts, carefully sifting through the dirt for remains. Crowds of spectators had begun arriving from across the Midwest, turning the investigation into a macabre carnival. Enterprising locals set up stands, selling sandwiches and lemonade to the crowds. Children were caught trying to sneak onto the property to collect souvenirs. Sheriff Smutzer had to post armed guards around the perimeter to maintain order and preserve the integrity of the crime scene. The discoveries grew more horrific with each passing day. In an old well that had been filled in, they found the remains of Jenny Olson, Belle's adopted daughter, who had supposedly gone to California. The 16-year-old had been bludgeoned to death, her skull showing multiple fractures from what appeared to be a heavy, blunt instrument. Her body had not been dismembered like the others, suggesting either a different motive or a killing that had occurred before Belle had perfected her method. Among the identified victims was John Moe from Elbow Lake, Minnesota, who had arrived at the farm in December 1906. His brother Peter had kept all of John's letters, including one that mentioned he was bringing $1,800 to invest in our future together. John's remains were identified by a distinctive boot heel repair and a pocket knife Peter had given him. The money, of course, was never found. Ole Budsberg from Iola, Wisconsin, was recognized by his sons, Oscar and Matthew, who had wondered why their elderly father had suddenly decided to remarry without telling them. They had received a brief letter saying he had found happiness with a widow in Indiana, then nothing more. His remains showed evidence of poisoning. The bones had absorbed enough strychnine that chemical tests could still detect it 2 years after death. Henry Gerholt from Scandia, Kansas, had disappeared in 1905 after responding to one of Belle's ads. His remains were found with papers still in his pocket. Belle had apparently been in too much of a hurry to search this body thoroughly. The papers included a bank draft for $2,500 that Belle had been unable to cash without Gerholt's signature. This oversight suggested that not all of Belle's murders had gone according to plan. By mid-May 1908, LaPorte had been transformed from a quiet railroad town into the center of a national sensation. Journalists from Chicago, New York, and even San Francisco descended upon the town, filling every hotel room and boarding house. The LaPorte Herald-Argus, the local newspaper, published special editions twice daily to keep up with developments. Telegraph lines buzzed constantly as reporters filed stories that would appear on front pages across America. The Gunness farm had become a macabre tourist attraction that drew thousands daily. Special trains ran from Chicago, advertised as "See the Murder Farm" excursions. One entrepreneur from Michigan City brought in a photographer and sold postcards depicting the excavation sites, the ruins of the house, and even some of the recovered remains before Sheriff Smutzer banned the practice. Local farmers charged visitors to park wagons and automobiles in their fields. Children sold fragments of brick and wood they claimed came from the Gunness house, though most were ordinary debris collected from anywhere. The investigation increasingly focused on Ray Lamphere, Belle's former hired hand, who had been arrested the day after the fire. A thin, nervous man in his 30s with a reputation for drinking and instability, Lamphere had worked for Belle from August 1907 to February 1908. His relationship with his employer had been complicated. Some witnesses suggested they had been lovers, others that he had been terrified of her. What was clear was that after Belle fired him in February, he had been heard making threats and dark insinuations about her activities. Under interrogation by Sheriff Smutzer and prosecutor Ralph Smith, Lamphere's story changed almost daily. First, he claimed to have been with Elizabeth Smith, an African-American woman who ran a boarding house on the outskirts of town, the entire night of the fire. When Mrs. Smith refuted this, saying he had left her place before midnight, he admitted to being near the farm but denied starting the fire. Then he conceded he had seen the flames, but felt no obligation to warn anyone because Belle had ruined his life. More damaging evidence emerged when police searched Lamphere's quarters at the Wheatbrook farm where he had been working. They found John Moe's overcoat, monogrammed with his initials, and Andrew Helgelian's gold watch chain. Lamphere claimed Belle had given these to him as payment for work, but could provide no witnesses to corroborate this story. They also found letters in Lamphere's possession, written in a crude attempt to disguise the handwriting, threatening Belle with exposure if she didn't pay him $500. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Louis Schultz, a prominent LaPorte dentist, came forward with a startling claim. He announced that he had created distinctive gold bridgework for Belle Gunness just 6 months earlier and could identify it precisely. Miraculously, within hours of this announcement, Sheriff Smutzer's men discovered this exact bridgework in the ashes of the house, despite previous thorough searches finding nothing. The discovery of the bridgework was immediately controversial. Many questioned how gold teeth could survive intact when the fire had been hot enough to melt glass and reduce bones to ash. More suspicious was the timing. The bridgework was found only after Dr. Schultz had publicly described it. Several witnesses, including Deputy Sheriff William Anstis, reported seeing someone matching Schultz's description near the ruins early that morning, before the official discovery. New witnesses emerged daily with stories about Belle's activities. Elnora Laphook, who had worked as a domestic servant for Belle from 1905 to 1906, provided chilling testimony about life inside the Gunness household. She spoke of being forbidden from entering the cellar, of strange noises at night that Belle explained away as the hogs getting restless, and of the constant smell of chloroform that Belle claimed was for medical purposes. She recalled male visitors arriving with luggage and hope in their eyes, then disappearing without explanation, their belongings absorbed into the household as if they had never existed. Mrs. Gunness would serve these men elaborate meals, Elnora testified. She was proud of her Norwegian cooking, fish soup, meat pudding, sweet cakes. The men always seemed drowsy afterward, sometimes barely able to keep their eyes open. She would tell me to retire early on those nights, and in the morning the visitor would be gone. She would say they had left before dawn for business, but their luggage would still be in the guest room. When I asked about it, she would become very cold and tell me it was not my concern. As May turned to June, the scope of Belle's crimes continued to expand. Letters poured in from across the Midwest, from families wondering if their missing relatives might be among the victims. The Norwegian community in particular was devastated. These were their people, fellow immigrants who had come to America seeking better lives, only to meet horrible deaths at the hands of one of their own. From Wisconsin came August Gunderson, searching for his brother Olaf, who had disappeared in 1904 after mentioning a Norwegian widow with a prosperous farm. From Minnesota, the Lindblom family sought news of Eric, who had withdrawn his savings and vanished in 1906. From Iowa, from the Dakotas, from Missouri, the letters accumulated, each telling a similar story of a bachelor with modest savings who had answered a matrimonial advertisement and never returned. Sheriff Smutzer established a makeshift identification bureau, bringing in experts from Chicago to help match remains with missing persons reports. They used everything available: dental records, though few immigrants had them, distinctive clothing, personal effects, even the analysis of bones to determine age and origin. The process was painstaking and often inconclusive. Many bodies were too decomposed or dismembered to identify positively. Among the confirmed victims was Tonez Tony Lean from Rushford, Minnesota, identified by a distinctive ring his sister recognized. He had brought $200 to Belle in 1906. George Anderson from Tarkio, Missouri, was identified by a malformed foot bone from a childhood injury. He had arrived at the farm with $3,000 in 1905. Olaf Svenherud from Chicago had come with $2,000 in March 1907. Each identification represented not just a murder, but a family's savings, a lifetime of work stolen along with life itself. The pattern of Belle's operation became clearer with each victim identified. She had been remarkably systematic in her target selection. The men were invariably Norwegian bachelors between 40 and 60 years old, successful enough to have accumulated savings, but without close family ties in America. They were men who could disappear without immediate alarm being raised, whose absence might not be noticed for months or even years. Belle had also been careful about geography, never taking too many victims from one area. Her advertisements appeared in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, but she rotated them, never running the same ad in the same paper for more than a few weeks. When families did inquire about missing relatives, she had ready explanations. They had returned to Norway, gone to Alaska for gold, or decided to try their luck in California. The investigation revealed that Belle had maintained extensive correspondence with multiple victims simultaneously. In a trunk recovered from the ruins, investigators found carbon copies of letters she had sent. She had been using carbon paper to keep track of her lies to different men. The letters showed a remarkable ability to tailor her approach to each victim. To religious men, she quoted scripture and spoke of finding a godly companion. To those who mentioned loneliness, she wrote of warm fires and loving family meals. To those who boasted of their savings, she hinted at business opportunities and land expansion. As summer progressed, the legal case against Ray Lamphere was building, though it was far from airtight. Prosecutor Ralph Smith faced a peculiar challenge. He was trying to convict Lamphere of murdering Belle Gunness, but couldn't prove Belle Gunness was actually dead. The headless corpse found in the basement remained unidentified, despite the suspicious discovery of the bridgework. Lamphere's defense team, led by former Judge Wirt Worden, had begun constructing an alternative narrative that was both sensational and disturbingly plausible. They argued that Belle Gunness was alive, that she had orchestrated her own disappearance by murdering a substitute victim and her own children to cover her escape. The defense had hired their own investigators who were uncovering evidence that supported this theory. Elmira Studebaker, a neighbor who lived half a mile from the Gunness farm, came forward with testimony that would prove crucial. On the night of April 27th, hours before the fire, she had been unable to sleep due to a sick child. Looking out her window around midnight, she had seen a heavily loaded wagon leaving the Gunness property. The wagon was driven by a woman matching Belle's description, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy veil despite the darkness. A man who wasn't Lamphere sat beside her. The wagon had headed towards Stillwell, where the railroad depot offered connections to Chicago and beyond. William Clifford, the night station agent at Stillwell, corroborated part of this story. He remembered a woman purchasing a ticket to Chicago on the early morning train of April 28th, just hours before the fire. She had been heavily veiled and carried several large carpet bags. She paid in cash, crisp bills that seemed fresh from a bank. When asked if she needed help with her luggage, she had declined in accented English, her voice low and controlled. Clifford couldn't positively identify her as Belle, but the timing and circumstances were suspicious. Meanwhile, Lamphere's behavior in jail was increasingly erratic. He would alternate between proclaiming his innocence and hinting at dark knowledge about Belle's crimes. To his cellmate, Harry Myers, he confided fragments of a larger story. Mentions of chloroform, of bodies buried at night, of Belle's strength in carrying corpses to the cellar. But when pressed for details by authorities, he would retreat into sullen silence or contradictory accounts. The defense team uncovered more evidence suggesting Belle had planned her escape carefully. In the weeks before the fire, she had liquidated many assets. She had sold livestock below market value, telling buyers she was planning to focus on grain farming. She had withdrawn large sums from her bank accounts, explaining she needed cash for spring planting. She had even visited her lawyer, Melvin Leleater, to update her will, leaving everything to her children. Children she would soon murder if the prosecution's theory was correct. Most damning was the testimony of Charles Edwardson, a Norwegian immigrant who worked as a clerk at the Roomley Banking Company. He swore that on April 27th, the day before the fire, Belle had come to the bank with a large amount of gold certificates and bonds, converting them all to cash. The amount was staggering, over $30,000 by his estimate. When bank president Harvey Darroch had questioned the wisdom of carrying such a sum in cash, Belle had replied, "Sometimes a woman must be prepared for sudden changes in fortune." The prosecution scrambled to counter this narrative. They brought in Dr. Walter Haynes, a forensic expert from Chicago, who testified that the remains found in the basement, while headless, showed distinctive scarring on the torso consistent with Belle's known medical history. She had suffered burns as a child in Norway that left permanent marks. But the defense's medical expert, Dr. Augustus Knab, disputed this, arguing the scarring could have been caused by the fire itself. The trial of Ray Lamphere began on November 9, 1908, in a packed LaPorte County courthouse. People had begun gathering outside the courthouse at dawn, hoping to secure one of the limited seats in the courtroom. Judge John Richter, a stern German-American known for maintaining strict order, had to station extra bailiffs to control the crowds. Journalists from major newspapers across the country filled an entire section, their telegraph operators standing ready to flash updates to eager readers nationwide. Prosecutor Ralph Smith opened with a dramatic presentation that painted Lamphere as a jealous accomplice turned murderer. He argued that Lamphere, having helped Belle dispose of numerous victims, had become a liability she sought to eliminate. When she fired him and threatened to have him committed to an insane asylum, he had snapped, returning in the early hours of April 28th to exact his revenge by burning the house with Belle and her children inside. Smith presented witness after witness who placed Lamphere near the farm on the night of the fire. John Soliem, a Hungarian immigrant who worked at a nearby farm, testified he had seen Lamphere running from the direction of the Gunness property around 3:30 a.m., shortly before the fire was discovered. Elizabeth Smith, despite being Lamphere's sometime lover, admitted under oath that he had left her house before midnight and returned after 4 a.m., agitated and smelling of kerosene. The physical evidence was compelling. The prosecution displayed John Moe's overcoat and Andrew Helgelian's watch, found in Lamphere's possession. They brought in chemists who testified that traces of kerosene found on Lamphere's boots matched the type sold at Dickinson's General Store, where Belle had purchased 5 gallons the day before the fire. They even produced a witness, Daniel Hudson, who claimed Lamphere had drunkenly confessed to him, "I fixed Belle good, she won't be cutting up any more men." But the defense, led by the eloquent Vert Worden, systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. Worden was a formidable figure, 6 feet tall, with a commanding voice that could shift from thunderous denunciation to sympathetic whisper. He had spent months preparing, and his opening statement electrified the courtroom. "Gentlemen of the jury, you are being asked to convict a man of murdering someone who is very much alive, someone who has orchestrated the most elaborate disappearing act in criminal history." Worden presented the case that Belle Gunness had murdered a substitute victim to fake her own death. He brought in witness after witness who testified that the body found in the basement couldn't have been Belle. Neighbors who had known her for years swore the corpse was too small. Dr. Charles Meredith, who had treated Belle just months before, testified that she was at least 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds, while the corpse was 5 feet 3 inches and weighed no more than 150 pounds. The defense's most dramatic moment came when they demonstrated the implausibility of the bridgework discovery. They had a dentist recreate Belle's supposed bridgework and subjected it to fire conditions similar to those at the farmhouse. The gold melted and deformed, the porcelain cracked and discolored, nothing like the pristine bridgework allegedly found in the ashes. When Dr. Schultz was recalled to explain this discrepancy, he became flustered and evasive, finally admitting he couldn't be certain the found bridgework was the one he had made for Belle. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Gunness case intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this incredible trial. The most sensational testimony came from Lamphere himself, though not in the way anyone expected. Taking the stand against his lawyer's advice, Lamphere admitted to knowing about Belle's murders, but denied killing her. His testimony was rambling and often contradictory, but certain details rang true. He described how Belle would drug her victims' coffee with chloral hydrate, wait for them to become unconscious, then strike them with a cleaver she kept in the cellar. He told of helping her carry bodies to the basement, where she would dissect them on a wooden table, her butcher skills allowing her to quickly reduce a corpse to manageable pieces. She was strong as 2 men, Lamphere testified, his voice shaking. She could carry a body down those stairs like it was a sack of flour. She'd work all night sometimes, cutting and wrapping. The next day, we'd bury the pieces in the hog pen or dump them in the soft spots around the property. She'd pour quicklime over everything to speed up the decomposition. The hogs would root around in those areas, and if anyone noticed disturbed earth, she'd say it was just the animals. Lamphere claimed Belle had killed at least 42 men, possibly more. She had murdered for money primarily, but also for convenience. Anyone who knew too much or asked too many questions. He swore that Jenny Olsen had been killed because she had discovered Belle's activities and threatened to go to the authorities. The girl had been struck down with a mattock in the barn, then buried in the old well. The defense used Lamphere's own testimony to support their theory that Belle was alive. According to Lamphere, Belle had been planning her escape for months, ever since Asle Helgelian had started writing letters asking about his brother. She knew investigation was inevitable. She had hired a woman from Chicago, supposedly as a housekeeper, but actually as a substitute corpse. On the night of April 27th, Belle had chloroformed this unknown woman and her own children, arranged their bodies in the cellar, and set the fire with multiple sources to ensure complete destruction. The jury deliberated for 26 hours, their discussions audible as heated arguments through the courthouse walls. The town held its breath, business virtually suspended as everyone waited for the verdict. When the jury finally returned on November 26, 1908, Thanksgiving Day, their decision satisfied no one. They found Lamphere guilty of arson but not guilty of murder. It was a compromise verdict that suggested the jury believed Belle had started the fire, but couldn't determine who had killed the victims found in the cellar. Judge Richter sentenced Lamphere to 2 to 21 years in the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City. Lamphere received the news stoically, perhaps relieved to have escaped the death penalty. As he was led away, he turned to the packed courtroom and said, "She's out there somewhere, counting her money and laughing at all of us." Those words would haunt Laporte for decades to come. The verdict left more questions than answers. If Belle was dead, who was the headless woman in the basement? If she was alive, where had she gone? How many victims were still buried on the property? The official investigation continued sporadically, with occasional excavations yielding more bones but no more identifiable victims. The property itself became cursed in local folklore. No one would buy it intact, so it was eventually subdivided and sold piecemeal. Lamphere's time in prison was brief but eventful. He developed tuberculosis almost immediately, the disease ravaging his already weakened constitution. As his health deteriorated, he became increasingly desperate to tell his story. He wrote rambling letters to newspapers, made statements to guards, and finally, in December 1909, made a detailed confession to Reverend Edwin Schell, the Methodist minister who had been providing him spiritual comfort. On December 30th, 1909, Ray Lamphere died in the prison hospital, his body racked by tuberculosis. But before his death, he had made a full confession to Reverend Schell, who struggled with whether to make it public. When he finally did, in January 1910, Lamphere's confession provided the most complete picture yet of Belle Gunness's crimes, though it raised as many questions as it answered. According to Lamphere's confession, Belle's system was horrifyingly efficient. She would place advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, specifically targeting older bachelors with savings, but no close family. She would correspond with multiple victims simultaneously, using carbon paper to keep track of her various deceptions. When a victim arrived, she would welcome him warmly, serving elaborate Norwegian meals that reminded these lonely men of home. The murder method varied depending on circumstances. Sometimes she drugged the coffee or food with chloral hydrate, waiting until the victim was unconscious before striking with her cleaver. Other times, she would wait until the man was asleep, then enter his room with a chloroform-soaked cloth. For particularly suspicious or resistant victims, she used strychnine, though this was riskier as the symptoms were distinctive and the death more prolonged. She enjoyed the killing, Lamphere had told Reverend Schell. She would hum Norwegian folk songs while she worked in the cellar, cutting up the bodies. She had a system, head first, then hands and feet, then arms and legs, finally the torso. She would wrap each piece in burlap, sometimes keeping them in the cellar for days until she could bury them safely. She knew exactly where every body was buried. She kept a map in her head. The money was carefully laundered through various banks across northern Indiana and southern Michigan. Belle would deposit small amounts in different banks, never enough to attract attention. She also converted cash to gold certificates and bonds, which were easier to transport and hide. Lamphere estimated she had accumulated over $250,000, equivalent to over $7 million today, from her victims. Most shocking was Lamphere's account of the night of the fire. He swore that Belle had planned everything meticulously. The unknown woman from Chicago had been lured with a promise of employment as a housekeeper. Belle had chloroformed her on April 27th, then bludgeoned her and removed her head to prevent identification. The head was weighted with stones and thrown into a deep pond on the property, which explained why it was never found, despite extensive searching. Belle had then chloroformed her own children. Lamphere claimed she showed no emotion as she carried their unconscious bodies to the cellar. She said they would be better off dead than living with the knowledge of what she had done, Lamphere recalled. She said she was giving them mercy. Whether the children were still alive when the fire started, Lamphere couldn't say. Belle had sent him away before setting the fires. The fire itself was set with multiple sources, kerosene-soaked rags placed strategically throughout the house to ensure complete destruction. Belle had removed anything of value beforehand, including her money and important papers. She had left just enough evidence to suggest she had died in the fire, some jewelry, the planted bridge work, clothes arranged to suggest hasty flight from bed. Lamphere claimed to have helped Belle load a wagon with several trunks and driven her part of the way to Stillwell. But she had made him turn back before reaching the station. The last he saw of her, she was walking toward the depot in the pre-dawn darkness, a tall figure in black carrying heavy carpet bags. She had promised to send him money once she was safely away, but of course, nothing ever came. She had used him, and discarded him like all the others, leaving him to take the blame for her crimes. Following Lamphier's confession and death, sightings of Belle Gunness began pouring in from across the country. She was reportedly seen in Chicago, working as a housekeeper under an assumed name. She was spotted in San Francisco, boarding a ship for the Orient. She was recognized in New York, purchasing passage to Europe. None of these sightings could be confirmed, but they kept the story alive in the public imagination. The most credible sightings came from the Norwegian-American community. In 1910, a woman matching Belle's description was seen in Christiania, now Oslo, Norway, living quietly on a small farm. When American investigators finally arrived to check, the woman had vanished, leaving behind a hastily abandoned house and neighbors who spoke of a wealthy American woman who spoke Norwegian with a peculiar accent and seemed always watchful, always ready to flee. In 1916, a woman calling herself Esther Carlson appeared in Los Angeles, working as a housekeeper for elderly men who had a tendency to die suddenly, leaving her small bequests in their wills. She was arrested but released for lack of evidence. She disappeared before investigators could connect her to the Gunness case. Years later, photographs would surface suggesting a strong resemblance to Belle, but by then the trail had gone cold. The most significant development came in 1931 when Esther Carlson, the same name as the 1916 suspect, was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning August Lindstrom, a Norwegian-American man, for his money. The parallels to Belle's crimes were unmistakable. Carlson was the right age, the right build, and bore a striking physical resemblance to Belle. She had no documented history before 1908. In her possession were photographs of children who looked remarkably like those who had died in the Laporte fire. Two former Laporte residents, invited by authorities to view Carlson, swore she was Belle Gunness. They recognized her distinctive walk, her mannish hands, even a scar on her neck that Belle was known to have. But before a positive identification could be made, before she could be questioned about Laporte, Esther Carlson died of tuberculosis while awaiting trial. She was buried in a pauper's grave, taking her secrets with her. The mystery of Belle Gunness refused to die with the passing decades. In 1931, the arrest of Esther Carlson had briefly revived national interest in the case. When she died before trial, several investigators from the original case traveled to Los Angeles to view her body. Sheriff Albert Smutzer, now in his 70s, made the journey despite failing health. After viewing the body, he stated to reporters, "I cannot say for certain, but if that woman isn't Belle Gunness, then she's her twin sister." The resemblance was that striking. Throughout the 1930s, former investigators and journalists attempted to piece together a more complete picture of Belle's crimes. In 1935, a retired Chicago detective named Martin Holian claimed to have tracked Belle's movements after the fire. According to his investigation, she had traveled under the name Bella Peterson through Chicago to New York, where she had boarded a ship to Europe in May 1908. He had traced her to Norway, where locals in Trondheim reported a wealthy American woman buying a remote farm in 1909, only to disappear again in 1910 when American investigators began making inquiries. The most significant development came in 1940, when construction workers expanding Route 35 near Laporte uncovered a cache of bones in what had been part of the Gunness property. The remains of at least 5 individuals were found, all showing signs of dismemberment consistent with Belle's known victims. Among the bones, workers found a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials TL. Investigation revealed this likely belonged to Thomas Lien, who had disappeared in 1906. This discovery suggested that many more victims remained buried on the property. In 1943, a professor of criminology at Northwestern University, Dr. Ernst Hoffmann, published the first comprehensive study of the Gunness case. His analysis, based on interviews with surviving witnesses and review of court records, estimated that Belle had likely killed between 40 and 50 victims. He noted that her victim selection showed remarkable sophistication. She had created what he called a murder system that anticipated many elements of organized crime. She understood market segmentation, targeting only Norwegian bachelors, risk management, never taking too many victims from one area, and money laundering, distributing funds across multiple banks. The 1950s brought new revelations when several deathbed confessions emerged from people who claimed knowledge of Belle's escape. In 1952, a woman named Martha Steinbach, dying in a Chicago hospital, claimed she had been hired by Belle in April 1908 to provide a corpse. According to Steinbach, Belle had paid her $500 to identify a homeless woman who matched Belle's general build, lure her with promise of work, and deliver her to a predetermined location. Steinbach claimed she had done so, though she insisted she didn't know the woman would be murdered. Her confession could never be verified, but the details matched known facts about the case. The Gunness farm itself underwent many transformations over the decades. The property was subdivided in the 1920s, with parts sold to different owners who tried to escape its dark history. But the land seemed cursed. Crops failed, animals sickened, and families who lived there reported strange occurrences. Not supernatural events, but practical reminders of the past. Bones surfacing after heavy rains, depressions in the earth where bodies had been buried, the occasional discovery of a corroded piece of jewelry or button in the garden soil. By the 1950s, most of the original Gunness property had been developed into small residential plots, but the discoveries continued. Every few years, construction or gardening would unearth more bones, more remnants of Belle's victims. The local authorities eventually stopped investigating each discovery. After 40 years, there was no hope of identification, and the bones were simply reinterred in a potter's field reserved for the unknown victims of the Gunness farm. The LaPorte County Historical Society Museum maintains the most comprehensive collection of Gunness artifacts and documents. The exhibit includes photographs of Belle and her victims, letters she wrote to lure men to their deaths, and even some of the physical evidence from the investigation. The museum's guest book shows visitors from around the world, drawn by fascination with one of America's most prolific serial killers. Among the most chilling exhibits are Belle's letters to Andrew Helgelien, displayed alongside his responses. Reading them in sequence, knowing the outcome, is a heartbreaking journey through manipulation and murder. Andrew's letters show a lonely man finding hope in Belle's promises, planning a future that would end in a shallow grave. His final letter, written the day before he left for LaPorte, ends with, "I go to you with joy in my heart and trust in our future together." By the time you read this, I will be on my way to begin our new life. The impact on the Norwegian-American community was profound and lasting. The Gunness case reinforced negative stereotypes about immigrants and created a climate of suspicion within the community itself. Norwegian bachelor farmers became objects of pity and suspicion, potential victims or potential predators. The community newspapers that had carried Belle's advertisements implemented new policies, requiring verification of advertisers' identities and warning readers about matrimonial frauds. Modern criminal profilers who have studied the case note that Belle Gunness was decades ahead of her time in terms of criminal sophistication. She understood the value of selecting victims who wouldn't be immediately missed, of varying her hunting grounds to avoid pattern detection, and of maintaining a respectable facade that deflected suspicion. She pioneered techniques that would later be seen in other serial killers. The use of personal ads to lure victims, the exploitation of immigrant communities, the systematic disposal of bodies. The question of Belle's ultimate fate remains one of criminology's great unsolved mysteries. The evidence strongly suggests she escaped the fire and lived for years afterward under an assumed identity. The Esther Carlson connection, while never definitively proven, is compelling. If Belle did escape, she successfully evaded justice for crimes that likely claimed over 40 lives, making her not just one of America's most prolific serial killers, but also one of the most successful in terms of avoiding capture. Modern criminal profilers who have studied the case note that Belle Gunness was decades ahead of her time in terms of criminal sophistication. She understood the value of selecting victims who wouldn't be immediately missed, of varying her hunting grounds to avoid pattern detection, and of maintaining a respectable facade that deflected suspicion. She pioneered techniques that would later be seen in other serial killers. The use of personal ads to lure victims, the exploitation of immigrant communities, the systematic disposal of bodies. By the mid-1950s, the site of the Gunness farm had been completely transformed, covered by modest homes and small gardens. The new residents occasionally reminded of their property's dark history when true crime enthusiasts came seeking the location of America's murder farm. Some homeowners reported finding old bones while gardening, usually dismissed as animal remains, though doubt always lingered. The local historical society occasionally received calls from people who think they've found something significant, though nothing was definitively linked to Belle's victims after the 1940 road construction discoveries. The psychological impact of the Gunness case extended far beyond LaPorte. It challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and violence in American society. The idea that a woman could be capable of such systematic, cold-blooded murder for profit was so disturbing that many preferred to believe she had male accomplices who did the actual killing. Even today, some researchers argue that Belle couldn't have physically managed the murders and disposals alone, though the evidence suggests otherwise. Belle Gunness also changed how Americans thought about rural safety. The farm, that symbol of American wholesome values and honest work, had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. The widow, traditionally an object of sympathy and protection, had become a predator. The immigrant success story had become a nightmare. These inversions of expected social roles created a lasting unease that influenced American popular culture for generations. Law enforcement learned crucial lessons from the Gunness case. The investigation highlighted the need for better communication between jurisdictions, more systematic missing persons tracking, and improved forensic techniques. The bungling of evidence at the crime scene led to reforms in how mass murder sites were processed. The case also demonstrated the vulnerability of immigrant communities and the need for better protection of isolated individuals who might fall prey to predators. The influence of the Gunness case on popular culture has been enormous. She has been the subject of numerous books, films, documentaries, and even a musical. The image of the Black Widow killer, a woman who murders husbands or suitors for money, became a staple of crime fiction. The phrase murder farm entered the American lexicon as shorthand for rural horror. Belle herself became an archetypal figure, the monstrous feminine that haunts the darker corners of the American imagination. In examining the case over a century later, what emerges is not just a story of individual evil, but a portrait of a time and place where such evil could flourish. The isolation of rural America, the vulnerability of immigrant communities, the limited communication and law enforcement resources of the era, and the social attitudes that made it inconceivable that a woman could be a serial killer. All these factors combine to allow Belle Gunness to kill for years with impunity. The final death toll of Belle's crimes will never be known with certainty. Conservative estimates place it at 14 confirmed victims, but when unidentified remains and missing persons reports are considered, the number could easily exceed 40. Each victim represented not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, savings stolen, dreams crushed. The ripple effects of her crimes spread through generations of Norwegian-American families who lost fathers, brothers, and sons to her calculated cruelty. The mystery of Belle Gunness endures because it touches on fundamental fears and fascinations. The fear of the stranger who seems friendly, the neighbor who hides dark secrets, the lover who plots murder. The fascination with someone who could kill without conscience, who could murder their own children to facilitate escape, who could view human life purely in terms of monetary value. Belle Gunness was a monster, but a very human monster, and perhaps that's what makes her story so enduringly terrifying. This mystery shows us that evil can hide behind any face, in any place, even in the heartland of America. What do you think happened to Belle Gunness? Do you believe she died in that fire, or did she orchestrate the perfect escape, living out her days under another name, her fortune built on blood? Leave your comment below. Your theory might be closer to the truth than we know. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's darkest mysteries and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves true crime. Remember, sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary horrors, and sometimes the monsters who walk among us are never caught. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the past is never as distant as we'd like to believe.